I think it's a gloomy summit, and I think Donald Trump is the reason for it. We have a massive shift at the G20 from a world 20 years ago or 18 years ago when the G20 was founded, where there was an optimism and a belief that the global challenges could be solved working together multilaterally. Multilateralism is now virtually dead, and bilateral meetings are dominating the summit. There's a resurgence of nationalism, protectionism, and authoritarianism where democracy has been declining for over a decade now. And as all of this is happening, Donald Trump is accelerating those ideas by encouraging nations to put their own interests ahead of the mutual interests of the planet. And that means not solving global challenges together. It means turning inward rather than looking outward.
Well, in the middle of it all, of course, is the host, Angela Merkel. How is she doing on that score?
Well, as the leader of the free world willingly gives up that title, and by that I mean Donald Trump, there's a vacuum to be filled. Now, Angela Merkel would be the prime candidate, but she's not going to do that because Germany does not have the resources to become the leader of the free world, and Germany does not want to take on the burdens of being the leader of the free world. And that means that as this global order gets shattered increasingly by Donald Trump's decision to retreat from the global stage, Russia and China are going to be picking up the pieces. And if you care about liberal values like democracy, human rights, and basic freedom of the press, for example, the world that is crafted much more at the hands of Russia and China is not going to respect those values. So I think it's a very sad day, and that's why I do have a gloomy take on what's happening now in Hamburg.
A gloomy take on what's happening in Hamburg. What were your thoughts when you saw, Brian, this speech that Donald Trump gave on Thursday where he said, quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive"?
Well, I was disappointed to see that he was casting the West as a cultural and religious bloc as opposed to a bloc of values and democracy. He didn't say the word democracy in his speech, which would have had Ronald Reagan rolling in his grave, because one of the legacies of Reagan's Republicans was defeating communism and sowing the seeds of democracy in Eastern Europe. The second thing that I was very disappointed at is that he's not acknowledging the fact that he's right that the future of the West is at stake. He just misdiagnosed the fact that the cause is himself. We've seen in the last 6 months attitudes towards U.S. leadership plummet. Confidence in American leadership has fallen 75% in Germany, 70% in France, 57% in the UK, and that's from just Obama to Trump. And so the West as a cohesive bloc is at stake, but the splinter is being driven by Donald Trump. And that's why I think he needs to take some reflection and think about how to not simply sour relations with the most important allies, and those are the allies in Western Europe.
But we had the election of Emmanuel Macron. We were just talking about Angela Merkel. Isn't there a fight back against all that?
There is, but frankly, when the U.S. is going against a splintered Europe, the U.S. is going to be the thing that changes the winds of history. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing around the world that Europe cannot fill the void that's created by a retreating United States. So yes, I am heartened to see Emmanuel Macron try to step up to the plate. I'm heartened to see Angela Merkel do the same. I just don't believe that they can fill the role of a superpower because, simply put, the resources are not there, the military might is not there, and the ability to shoulder the burdens of global leadership are not sufficiently possible in those two countries.
Brian Klaas, Doug Herbert here. Do you think, maybe it's wildly optimistic, but Angela Merkel perhaps is holding out a hope that she could bring Donald Trump around to some of her views, at least perhaps where climate change is concerned? Do you think that is a possibility, however remote?
No, frankly. I think that there have been people who are now misguided optimists when it comes to Trump. We were told during the primaries that wait for the general election, you'll have a more presidential Donald Trump. We were told after the election, wait for when he takes office, we'll have a more presidential Donald Trump. The man is who he is. I mean, the one thing that I can say is absolutely clear about him is he's consistent on this aspect. He's consistent about protectionism. If you look at tapes of Donald Trump in the 1980s, he is railing against Japan taking advantage of the United States in trade deals. It's just different players, but he's always been talking about the same message. The idea that Angela Merkel can come in, and they have a pretty bad relationship to begin with, and turn him around on something that is an absolute core part of his ideology and worldview, I think is naive. So I think what Europe needs to do is they need to come to grips with the fact that this is the man who is going to be leading the United States for the next 3.5 years, and they have to decide, are we going to try to fill the vacuum, even if it's only partially, or are we going to simply buy into his mentality and turn inward and not try to solve the challenges the United States is running away from?
All right, which brings us back to that sideline meeting with Vladimir Putin. There were all these articles in the press, Brian Klaas, saying, watch out, Trump is going to basically almost give away the codes to the bomb, it seems, that Vladimir Putin's a former KGB agent, that he's going to outsmart Trump. What are your thoughts on this meeting?
Well, there's a few things here. One is that Trump is absolutely outgunned when it comes to savviness in diplomacy with the Russians. There are two officials in the meeting on the Russian side, Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin. They have about 80 years of government experience between the two of them, and Putin has a lot of experience in the KGB, which he was in charge of the FSB as well. Trump and Tillerson are the American side. They have less than 12 months experience between the two of them. Tillerson knows oil, not national security. Trump knows real estate and television, not national security. And so I'm very worried about the meeting. They had no script. Donald Trump famously does not read briefings unless they are put in very simple bullet points, or as one aide recently said, tweet-length statements. I mean, at some point we have to stop mincing our words. He is not prepared for this. And that's where I'm really worried that when he goes into this meeting, he is going to come out trying to, say that it was a success and that he got everything he wanted. But, the odds are that he's going to continue shooting from the hip straight into America's foot on the global stage, as he's been doing on Twitter and elsewhere for a very long time now as president.
Just let me ask you, Brian Klaas, about the G20 as a whole now. We've talked about Donald Trump, but if we think back 10 years ago when the financial crisis broke out, the G20 was this important get-together where leaders worked out a plan to stop the slide. Now, today, what is the future of meetings like this one?
Well, for the foreseeable future, it's going to be increasingly less important. You're absolutely right. I mean, multilateralism through the G20 was a way to solve problems. Now it's much more about photo ops and bilateral meetings. And bilateral meetings don't require a summit. And I think this is the sad reality is we're going to have a pushback on Europe is going to continue with multilateralism. We see this with trade negotiations with Japan, the EU, et cetera. But increasingly, as the U.S. sets the agenda and says we do bilateral negotiation, other countries are going to be freed up to do the same. And this is where I am worried. I don't want to be alarmist or cry wolf here, but the resurgence of nationalism, the resurgence of protectionism, and the rise of authoritarianism are all things that happen in history before crises. And so I think we're going down a very dark path. Now, that doesn't mean we can't pull ourselves back from the brink, but for the next 3.5 years, Donald Trump is setting the global agenda because the U.S. is still the only world superpower. And China has no real ambitions in the immediate term of taking its place and taking on the responsibilities that come with it. So, we have a very uncertain future going on, and the G20 may not have much of a role to play in it as countries turn insular. They think about America first, becoming Russia first, becoming China first, becoming Germany first. All of these countries, as they turn away from global challenges, we're in a much more interconnected world than we were 20 years ago when the G20 started. And so we need it more than ever, but it's becoming less and less relevant. And that's where I think we're making a huge mistake.
Brian Klaas, fellow at the London School of Economics, many thanks for joining us from London.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.